Welcome to the Army Heritage Center Foundation Lecture Series. I am Mike Perry and serve as the host for tonight's program. The U.S. Army Heritage Center Foundation is the Friends Group for the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center. Through donated support, the foundation enhances and promotes the center's outreach to the Army and to the public. Sponsor for tonight's program is FN America, a world leader in the manufacture of weapons and training devices for our military and police communities. Tonight, our program focuses on Army's adaptation and change based upon personal experience of its leaders during the 19th and early 20th century. Our presenter is Dr. J.P. Clark. Dr. Clark is a professor of military strategy teaching at the U.S. Army War College Basic Strategic Arts Program, the qualification focus for new Army strategists. He is also the editor-in-chief of War Room, the Army War College online journal. Dr. Clark, a retired Army colonel, served as an armor officer in tank battalions at Fort Stewart, Georgia, and in South Korea. As a strategist, he served on the personal staffs of the Secretary of the Army and the British Chief of the General Staff. As the Army's Chief of Joint Concepts, the Director of National Security Affairs at the Strategic Studies Institute, and as the Chief of the Strategy Division with the Army G35 in the Pentagon. Dr. Clark taught history at West Point. He holds a PhD and MA in history from Duke University, a Master of Strategic Studies from the Army War College, and a BS in Russian and German from the U.S. Military Academy. He is currently working on a history of U.S. Army military strategy in the Pacific from 1898 to 1941 to be published by the University of Press of Kansas. Well, good evening. Last week we looked at armies in retreat. Now we're looking more, I would guess, for how the Army prepares for offensive operations, since retreat's not a language that we like. So, Dr. Clark, welcome, and the floor is now yours.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Mike. It's such a privilege and honor to have this opportunity to speak about the history of the U.S. Army. And also just what it tells, as you kind of had mentioned, about change and adaptation in military organizations more generally. So very much thanks to you, the foundation, and all of us joining us for tonight for this talk. Naturally, kind of, the standard disclaimer applies that these are my own opinions and not necessarily those of the U.S. Army War College or Department of Defense. All right, excellent. Kind of see the slides there. Okay. All right, so next slide, please. Now, so I just love these two images showing the start and end points of my book. And so on top, we see the Battle of Chippewa in 1814. Below it is the Meuse-Argonne in 1918. Now, some of the changes that the U.S. Army underwent over that period are evident in these contrasting pictures. You can see the differences from smoothbore muskets to, magazine-fed high-power rifles, and conspicuous clothing, particularly if you're, one of the generals out front, to olive drab in order to better hide from all of those high-power magazine, fed rifles and machine guns that are out there on the battlefield. And so just a quick glance at these juxtaposed images gives some sense of how significant the changes in weapons, equipment, and tactics were over this period. But what I want to discuss tonight is something that is not visible, and that is a change in how the U.S. Army Officer Corps thought about war. I believe that virtually every officer who served throughout this whole period, from 1815 to 1918, would agree with the assertion that the main purpose of the Army in peace was to prepare for war. But I argue in the book that what most officers believed that meant went through 4 different stages. And so when they thought of preparing for war, there was 4 different ideas of what that actually entailed. And each of those different ideas was a marker of a new professional generation. And furthermore, so I argue that the first 3 generations, even though they were distinct from each other, they shared a fundamental idea about the nature of war that made them variations on the same theme. But for those officers who were commissioned from about 1890 onward, they had an idea of war that was their idea of what it meant to prepare for war was based off an understanding of conflict that was fundamentally different from those 3 preceding generations. So much so that it actually constitutes a major break in the professionalism. And so this is alluded to within the subtitle of the book, The Emergence of the Modern U.S. Army. And so I argue that the first 3 generations had, had a common understanding of what it meant to prepare for, or a common basic understanding of warfare, and that the generations from about 1890 on, and so think somebody like George C. Marshall, his generation on had had a fundamentally different idea of war, that while there are some distinctions, still is the same one that we have today. And so, and to kind of put a line under it, so we have William Sherman and Winfield Scott on one side of this divide, while everyone from George C. Marshall to those serving today is on the other. And before we move on, I'd like to make one final note on this shift. So those who really know their First World War history will recognize that if we're talking about those commissioned 1890 and afterwards, means that when World War I happened, this change was still underway, because the most senior officers of the American Expeditionary Forces under John J. Pershing were actually members of that older generation. And so some of my favorite portions of this book are those that are dealing with the split within the AEF between its most senior officers, who are part of the third generation, and the rest who came from the fourth generation, which is part of this new modern professionalism. And so just how late that transformation in how we think about war takes place shows that the kinds of the changes that we can see on this slide with all of the the weapons and the tactics and the equipment, those tend to lead, and it takes a while for ways of thinking to kind of catch up to those sorts of changes. And in fact, this is I build a book, and it takes so long that I build a book along a generational model, because I argue that that's how long it takes for these sorts of things to occur. Now, and so next slide, please. The idea that large-scale change in really institutions of the size of the U.S. Army occur on a generational timescale probably makes intuitive sense to most people, but using generations as a unit of analysis in history can really be pretty tricky. And particularly, it's difficult to figure out and to set down markers about when one generation ends and another begins. Precisely because change does occur over such a long period, change tends to be so gradual that resorting to some arbitrary measure of time, like the transition between one decade and the next, can be pretty unconvincing. I mean, if somebody is born on the last day of a decade, are they really all that different from somebody who's born on the very next day? And so, but what makes a professional generation is not just the passage of time or a flip of a calendar. Instead, it is the fact that all the members of a generation face a common set of problems, and that's what makes them a unit as a generation. So they have this common pool of beliefs and ideas about how to to draw upon to understand and help kind of solve some of those common problems that they're facing. So and to put it a different way, it's the environment that shapes a generation. And if the environment suddenly changes, well, then a new generation is born. Now, even though it might be very difficult to talk about generations at the national scale and in most contexts, the regular Army Officer Corps during the period of the book is an unusually good subject for a generational analysis. In part, this is because it was relatively small, and there were only a few sets of paths to becoming an officer. So the Officer Corps was pretty homogeneous, and so it was a fairly fixed unit. But what really makes the generational idea work for the book is that the Civil War was a short, clearly delineated event that was both extremely influential in how it shaped a generation, and also it was completely unlike what had come before and in the decades afterwards. So put simply, the Civil War made those who experienced it firsthand a distinct group, a generation that was separated from those who came before and after. So the Civil War naturally created three generations within the 19th century. And as put out a little bit earlier, so my book actually covers four generations. And so, so the boundary between the third and fourth generations, because it doesn't have such a clear delineated break, I say that that's a little bit more gradual and occurs around 1890, but I definitely don't want to fall into the trap of giving it like some very clean, dividing line. So So continuing that point, there was a gradual change in the environment. But for all of these 4 generations, what makes them distinct is, hey, what is this environment that shapes how they think it is to prepare for war? And to help describe the environment and get our arms wrapped around it, I kind of identify 3 types of shaping influences. And so the first is institutions. And these are all of the tools that the Army uses to deliberately shape itself, such as schools like the Army War College, but also doctrine and personnel policies. The second set of influences are experiences. And so these are all of the military influences that are outside of the control of the organization. So I've already mentioned the Civil War is one, but this can also be experiences in peace. So for instance, what does 20 years of service at small isolated posts when you only have like a handful of officers and maybe just 100 enlisted soldiers, what does 20 years of serving in that environment do to your professional worldview and what you think it means to prepare for war? And then the final set of influences is culture. And so these are all of the ideas and experiences that are coming from society at large. And so the civilian influences. Now, for a modern day example, think of the military TikTok videos that, you kind of see floating around. So TikTok is a tool that this generation has, and many would argue also shapes how they view the world, that simply just didn't exist 20 years ago. Now, kind of just in broad terms, even though culture refers to civilian influences, often civilian influences can have military implications. So for instance, particularly during this time of the 19th century, class attitudes shaped how officers dealt with enlisted soldiers, or racial attitudes, affected the conduct of operations in the Philippines, and even just kind of our idea about, the United States' place in the world can influence strategy. So those are the 3 categories. Now, it's important to note that I don't try to say that there's a fixed relationship between these. And so the relative strength of the influence each of these 3 influences will vary with a generation. So as already mentioned, a generation that serves in a defining conflict like the Civil War or World War II more recently will be largely shaped by experiences. But like a generation that comes of age in a time of great social transformation will be shaped more by culture. Now, the one thing that I would say, and this will probably get me in trouble because of where I work, is that generally institutions are the least important. And so what you experience, and even in an intense training environment like NTC, much less in combat, tends to outweigh what you read in doctrine. Excuse me. Similarly, you spend your whole life in society. So by just sheer weight of mass, this is going to outweigh the few years of military schooling that most people receive. The final note on generations is that I do not want to imply that they are monolithic, that everybody in a generation thought the same way. Far from it. Indeed, one of the best ways to identify a generation is to actually look at what its members choose to fight over. So 15 years ago, one of the major debates was whether counterinsurgency could work. And so it's kind of pitting the thinkers like John Nagel versus John Gentile. Now, if we look at the Marine Corps and the debate over Force Design 2030, the debate is over quite different things. And so we can almost see the generation changing according to what it argues over. And so next slide, please. So this takes us to our first generation, what I call the foundational generation. Now, it was almost entirely the product of experiences and culture because the Army almost had no institutions to speak of at the beginning of this. So before the War of 1812, the War Department was understaffed and crudely organized. The field army had no set doctrine, so commanders could choose whatever drill regulations the commander favored. And many officers owed their positions to political influence rather than merit. So the task of this generation, which was helped by unusually favorable political environment, was for military, was to build those institutions. And so next slide, please. So in short, the early portion of the foundational generation drew on its experience in the War of 1812 and taking cues from a lot of foreign militaries, particularly the French, set to the task of standardization, of building institutions so they could influence later generations. Now, arguably, the three figures you kind of see here are the most important. They certainly are the most emblematic. So Sylvanus Thayer is known as the father of West Point. He was the superintendent who instituted a rigorous set curriculum, determined what classes every cadet would take. And this would become important because one of the changes during this antebellum period was that West Pointers essentially gained a monopoly over new commissions, with a few exceptions. So these changes to West Point had an undue influence on shaping the larger professional generation. Now, Winfield Scott played a critical role, particularly in the decade after the War of 1812, in standardizing the field army. So while Thayer worked on education, Scott was at work in kind of doing daily life in the Army. And basically, he personally wrote the drill regulations and the general regulations, which between those two books really kind of set the stage of everything that the Army did on a daily basis. And finally, you have Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, who, while the other gentlemen are setting up the Army, Calhoun really sets up the modern War Department and creates structures that would persist for about a century until Root, who we'll talk about in a second. So historian Sam Watson has kind of pointed out in his work that due largely to the effort of these individuals and others like them, the War Department and the Army in the 1830s, 1840s were some of the most complex, capable, and large organizations in the United States at large. And so the ability to support far-flung operations under often difficult conditions was only possible because of this work of standardization and an increase in organizational sophistication that was the work of the foundational generation. And then the benefits of this were seen in the Mexican-American War, on the frontier, the buildup of a really complex system of coastal fortifications, as well as in things like river and harbor work and continental surveys that no other institution in the United States could have achieved. Next slide, please. So these successes of the foundational generation are often overlooked because we kind of suffer from the benefit of hindsight. In this case, it's not so much a benefit because all of the institutions that were created, even though they were effective, were built for a small army of only about 10,000 regulars. And so even large frontier expeditions at this time only had about, a few hundred troopers. So the institutions of the antebellum period were optimized to the size and the conditions of slow promotion, which allowed a reliance that basically you gain competence by on-the-job training. By one contemporary official estimate, within about 2 years of commissioning, most people knew pretty much everything they needed as a company grade officer, which meant they had mastered the skills that they would need for the first 3 decades or so of their careers. Now, this system would break down completely under the completely new environment. So once again, we have a new environment, so we have a new generation that is created by national mobilization for the Civil War. And so with the benefit of hindsight, the dangers of the Army's reliance on having good character and experience are obvious. And one of my favorite quotes on this is, from 1863, with Confederate General Richard Ewell. He kind of, wryly observed that in 20 years on the frontier and in Mexico, he had learned all about commanding 50 dragoons and forgotten everything else. He wasn't saying that complimentarily, but in Ewell's defense, that really had been all that the nation had required until 1861. But that was the year that you have a completely new environment. And so once again, a new generation. So next slide, please. So to illustrate the difference in conditions, a quick comparison of the West Point classes of 1846 and May 1861. So I selected them because these are 2 classes that graduated at the outset of a war are really useful. And so this comparison shows that the 2 cohorts at the at the individual level would have radically different experiences in their 2 respective wars. And it's important that we look at this, because often we look at, from the organizational standpoint, forgetting that really an organization in terms of learning is really just an amalgamation of a lot of individual experiences. And so how did the war look to the individual second lieutenant at the beginning of these two wars. And so first off, so the difference, the reason for this vast difference is that the United States raised armies in completely two different ways between these conflicts. In the Mexican-American War, the traditional system prevailed. And so that traditional system was that you had a regular army fight as a unit. And then you supplemented that with some militia, but more often a lot of volunteer units that were created specifically for the conflict and were almost entirely manned by volunteers. And under this system, the vast majority of regular officers stayed with their normal peacetime unit. And so for the most part, the only regulars who took volunteer commissions were higher level commanders and their staffs. And so at the individual level for the Mexican-American War, that meant you began the war as a lieutenant, you served with your assigned regiment as a lieutenant, and at the end of the war, you were a lieutenant. Although maybe you had like an honorific brevet promotion to captain, but that was about it. Now, at the beginning of the Civil War, Winfield Scott, who was still around well into his old age, fought to keep this same system going. And so for most of 1861, it prevailed. But by 1862, he was kind of marginalized, and the magnitude of the mobilization just made it impossible to keep all of the regulars confined in this small group of 20,000 soldiers, I think, about that time. So in 1862, regular officers were allowed to go out and serve with the volunteers at some higher rank. And so this completely changes the individual experience of war, which is nicely illustrated by the experience of Emory Upton, who figures very prominently in two of the chapters of the book. So Upton began as an artillery lieutenant and served that way throughout 1861. In 1862, he was a colonel commanding an infantry regiment. In 1863, he was a colonel commanding an infantry brigade. In 1864, he was a brigadier general commanding a brigade. And in 1865, he was a brigadier general commanding a cavalry division. So 4 years after graduation, he's a brevet major general, a volunteer brigadier general commanding an entire division. Completely different than, say, Grant in the Mexican-American War, who at the end of it, still a company grade officer. So what did this difference in individual experience mean for how the Army prepared for war? So how did this create a new generation distinct from the foundational generation? Because the Civil War generation, essentially, it was no longer that lieutenants and captains were going to serve as lieutenant and captains in war. Lieutenants and captains were suddenly going to become colonels and generals. And that poses a completely different problem for how you prepare for war. So next slide, please. Yeah, and kind of as I had mentioned earlier, we should not overgeneralize the experiences of a generation, but sometimes the disagreements tell you a little bit more about the generation. And here's a good example of this. So I just kind of gave you the experience of Emory Upton, who we see at the top. Shortly after the war, Upton met Sherman, who obviously was one of the top commanders of the war, and Sherman ended up kind of becoming a friend and a mentor, and kind of guided Upton's career. In a lot of cases, they really agreed on a lot of things, but in some aspects of military profession, that they had diametrically opposed views, which you kind of see here in these quotations. So even though Upton ended up at the end of the war as a general officer commanding a division, for the vast majority of his experience, he was really at the regiment and brigade level. And he served in some of the most vicious, hard-fought battles of the war, some of the bloodiest battles of the war. And that gave him a low opinion of a lot of his superior officers. And so the division and the corps commanders who he served under, he thought that they simply didn't know their business and were not ready to hold the positions of responsibility that they did. So his conclusion from this, which was in the minority for his generation, was that it was necessary to create schools in peacetime to help prepare junior officers to assume much higher rank in case of war. And this is precisely what he did at Fort Monroe in the late 1870s, about the time that he's writing these quotations. And in that, he was drawing on foreign militaries, particularly the Prussians, but also he was kind of drawing from some of the cutting edges of cultural expertise. And so this is a good example of that cultural influence, because right at the same time, this is when you see the legal and the medical professions starting to make a similar change to kind of codification of expertise. By contrast, Sherman began the war as a colonel, and within just a few months was promoted to brigadier general. And so when he looks back at the war, he thought that he had done just fine. And so whatever preparation he had had as a junior officer was clearly enough for everybody else. And so you see his opinion in the first quotation by his picture there. If you can command a company, you can command an army. And so Upton completely disagreed with that. And so the Sherman view was rooted in the idea that military skill, and so they called it genius at the time, was largely just inherent, and it was not something that the institution could give to you. You either had it or you didn't. But in the second quotations from each of these figures, you also see a tension that will come out more in this next generation of what balance to strike between preparing for a really big war like the Civil War and how much should be given to the daily common tasks of a frontier constabulary. And actually in this, conditions were not all that different than they were in the antebellum army. But now, for everybody who came afterwards, they had that memory of this huge civil war. And so there was this constant tension between the two. Next slide, please. So I call the third generation the composite generation, because they were the product of several sets of contradictory influences. And so as a result, they were the most fractured in their collective approach to preparing for war. And so part of this problem was that the army was geographically fragmented amongst, so it was only 27,000 strong, only over 2,000 officers at this time, but had nearly 200 posts. So the officer corps was spread out, so it didn't give a whole lot of chance for people to come together. And this was reinforced by the division of the army into regiments and to staff corps, that they didn't have a whole lot of groups coming together. And so with this fragmentary sort of nature, the composite generation was kind of doomed to develop in the shadow of the Army's one of the most momentous events of the century, the Civil War. And so in the 1880s, an average post might have about 3 or 4 Civil War veterans and only 2 or 3 members of the composite generation, who were then just stuck behind this large group of veterans who were not going to retire for a long time. And so kind of doomed this generation to working away as lieutenants for 2 or 3 decades in some cases. Next slide, please. So one of the few unifying factors for the composite generation, including for 3 future Army chiefs of staff, was that most of those who were West Pointers had Upton as a commandant. And so even though he was in the minority of his generation, he had a great vantage point as the commandant at West Point in most of the early 1870s to kind of seed his views throughout the composite generation. And here, these 2 figures, you kind of see a perfect example of although some of the strange ways that can manifest itself. So Arthur L. Wagner, we have on the left, Eben Swift, both were there under Upton. And although it's funny so Wagner was the type of cadet that Upton absolutely hated. And so Wagner graduated just from the third bottom of his class. He had a long disciplinary record. And so Upton, as the commandant, had often, put him in room confinement. And in fact, on the night before his graduation, Wagner was confined to his room. He threw a crazy party with alcohol because he wasn't going to be denied, the night before graduation. And Swift, actually, Cadet Swift, who was 1 year behind, actually happened to be there that night. Officer in charge bursts into the room, demands everybody. He goes, hey, who has anybody been drinking? Wagner kind of casually goes, well, yeah, and you can have some too. And, let me show you around. You can mingle around. And so the officer just left in a huff. But if he had reported that to Upton, Upton probably would have ended Wagner's military career the day before he got commissioned. With that, it's really ironic that Wagner did more to continue Upton's legacy than any other officer of his generation. And so once he settled down a little bit out in the Army, he continued the thread of Upton's tactics. And when Wagner was an instructor at Fort Leavenworth in the 1890s, against the wishes of the commanding generals, he worked to make it very much like a war college in the same way that Upton had done at Fort Monroe a couple decades earlier. And so in the early 20th century, we then had Wagner is going to introduce the after action review. So one of our staples of the Army today, to field maneuvers, which are some of the antecedents of realistic large scale field training that we do today. And he also was reordering the professional education system when he kind of died at a pretty young age from tuberculosis in 1905. But Wagner was very much in line with Upton of, hey, let's concentrate on the big costly wars. Now Swift took an entirely different course, even though it was Wagner who brought Swift to Leavenworth as one of his assistants. Now, in some ways, Swift was a great choice, and we'll talk a little bit about his, kind of the way that he revitalized training, and he did some great things there. He also actually introduced the 5-paragraph operations order, which we still have today. But even though Swift claimed that he was a disciple of Upton, he actually was far closer to Sherman. And so the problem was that Swift the only things that he thought were of value were these lower level tactical skills. And so when he was transferred to the Army War College, and shortly after it was created, so here's a school that's created to, train staff officers for armies and for corps and everything else like that. He was annoyed that the officers weren't getting practice in issuing out lower level orders. And so he actually brought in a phonograph, which at the time was cutting edge technology. And he was forcing officers he was recording them as they were giving a verbal order to, a patrol, which would have been great for a lower level tactical school, but not what the Army War College was founded to do. And there's a good example of, just because you're on the cutting edge of educational technology doesn't necessarily mean that you're a good teacher or that you're teaching the right things. And so you see that, but Swift is very much like, hey, let's just train people to be lieutenants and everything else will follow. So next slide, please. Now, in the 1890s, these disagreements really about professional education, what should be taught among the composite generation, were, so pardon the phrase, academic, because basically the school system was just so small and wasn't mandatory. It didn't really affect the Army much, so it didn't matter what you taught. It mattered for the individuals, but it didn't change the course of the institution. Now, that would all completely change in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. And so you have Secretary of War Elihu Root comes in, and that war, even though the United States won, exposed a lot of deficiencies of the Army to wage a conventional campaign. And so New York corporate lawyer, Root was an exemplar for many aspects of the progressive era, and so which is a period of huge reform. And he had helped professionalize the law, and he was a founding member of the American Bar Association. And he brought those same sorts of ideas with him to the military. And so he created a general staff, a professional education system to go along with it. He reformed the National Guard, introduced large-scale realistic field training for both regulars and for guardsmen. And he also placed talented young officers in key positions. And so, for instance, J. Franklin Bell, who was a hero in the Philippines, was promoted from captain to brigadier general in 1901. But as many dialed in know, the person at the top might direct something that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen as they desired. And shortly after Root got Congress to approve most of these changes, he departed. And so it's left to the composite generation, this generation that I described as being very kind of fractured in order to kind of figure out what all this means. And they're going to have, and the book goes at length into some of the disagreements, and basically they're working at cross currents. Next slide, please. But even though the Root reforms as they're implemented by the composite generation are imperfect, they nonetheless altered many of the Army's internal structures. And so schools and maneuvers and just a general consolidation of the Army that happened as the frontier was closing down allowed the progressive generation to come together as a far more as a really cohesive group that had a far less of a dispersion than the composite generation. But then also you have to remember what's going on in society. Progressive era is this time of radical militant change. And so there also was really, that was kind of infused throughout this new generation. So next slide. All of this is reinforced by the much more powerful school system that Root created. And I think that you can kind of see the differences here in these two pictures. And so we have West Point cadets who are reciting at the boards. And so for those of you who are West Pointers, you kind of appreciate some of this. That's very much about rote memorization. And that's kind of what most of the older officers were thinking of when you said education. But what was actually going on within like Fort Leavenworth in the 1900s is what you see in the lower right. And so one of the things that Swift did do that was very effective was introduce the German idea of wargaming. And if you just look at the body language of these officers, I mean, you can tell that they are engrossed in this act, and it's not rote memorization. They're working through problems, they're solving problems. And so this was far more effective. One of the interesting happenstances of this is that due to the timing, these are going to be the staff officers of the AEF in World War I. And because they were using German textbooks, you actually have a lot of the war games they were doing were in the sector of France that would become the AEF sector, American sector, in about just over a decade. So next slide, please. I also mentioned that an aspect of Root was he deliberately tried to circumvent the Army's system of promotion by seniority. And that was one of the few things he couldn't get Congress to budge on, by creating these opportunities for the best young officers to exercise significant responsibility way beyond their grades. And so Fort Leavenworth was kind of the fulcrum of the system. And so the Leavenworth, what would become Leavenworth Clique, they would go out as the small group, and these junior officers, lieutenants and captains, would have this huge role in helping to plan and organize and run the big summer training camp. And so one of the beneficiaries of this was First Lieutenant George C. Marshall, who effectively commanded a brigade of several thousand soldiers in a mock invasion of the Philippines, and he won as a first lieutenant. Now you can kind of see the self-assurance of this youthful elite, and they know that they're deliberately being crafted as an elite in this picture of Marshall and Palmer at the left. But on the right, there are some negative aspects to this as well. And so in the early 1910s, Captain Alfred W. Bjornstad was considered one of the most outstanding officers of his generation. He was key in writing some of the key doctrinal aspects. And later on, but he brought these ideas of this elite with him. And so when he was a brigadier general within the AEF, he was a chief of staff. He actually he ordered a large attack for the Third Corps, and deliberately did not tell his corps commander that he was ordering this attack, because he wanted to prove that the chief of staff, as in the German system, didn't need a commander, essentially. And so now Bjornstad was an extreme example, but Hugh Drum, who's another member of this, said that as he looked back, he goes, maybe for all of our talents, we were a little bit too overconfident. So next slide, please. And one of the key aspects of this is you have to remember the combat experience of the Philippines in the early 1900s that most of these officers went through. And so this picture shows you right here, they weren't too worried about Filipino fire. And they also learned a lot of the Filipinos would create trenches. And then basically, as soon as you charge the trench, they would abandon it. And so one of the problems of the progressive generation was they created, due to their early experience as lieutenants, they got this idea that field fortifications and firepower could be ignored, and that you could basically just through sheer force of will and overcome them in an attack. And so part of what you'll see in this next slide here is reflected in the 1911 entry drill regulations, which are co-written by Bjornstad, who I just mentioned. So the manual devoted little more than a page to machine guns, and they dismissed them as, machine guns are only weapons of mere emergency. So now, remember, this is 1911, just 3 years before World War I starts. Now, the manual gave a little bit more attention to artillery, but in the end, it said, nah, artillery is not that important. Rifle fire is. Once again, 3 years before, World War I. And if we go to the build the slide out. Okay, so I'm sorry, one more build, please. And now the astonishing thing is that even with the experience of World War I behind it, and so the Somme and Verdun are in 1916. Harold B. Fisk, who's another one of these, he had taught tactics at West Point, was part of Leavenworth, as part of the Leavenworth clique. As he reflects on the first 3 years of the First World War, he goes, yeah, everything we have in the drill regulations, which is these 2 quotations you see above, he goes, yeah, they're still proven out. And unfortunately, Fisk was going to go on and he was going to be the director of training in the AEF in World War I. So the last sort of person you'd want to have, kind of leading you. So now next slide. So this kind of sums up, the basic divide between those first 3 generations and then all the generations that come afterwards. And really what it gets down to is that we've moved from a system that it was all about the individual, so Winfield Scott comes in and says, hey, Winfield Scott made Winfield Scott. It's my natural inherent capabilities. Sherman said other things, where our modern ideas, you can't just go in and become a general officer because you have the talent. We feel like you have to go through certain steps. You have to go through schools like the Army War College, all of these sorts of things you need before you are fit to command. And so that at its crux, going from professionalism that's rooted in the individual to one that's rooted in institutions, is the change that we see. So next slide, and I can see that right about time as well. Happy to talk about any of these, but I think I'll just kind of draw out 2 quick points. First off, even though we tend to idolize, and rightly so, we prize experience in war and operations. If you remember the construct of institutions, experiences, and culture, because those experiences are so powerful, they really serve as an anchor for a generation that is marked by war. And so I find that those generations tend to be less adaptable. The other thing I would say is, because experiences and culture kind of happen without, they're not under the Army's control, change is going to happen. And then, because they're the strongest forces, change is going to happen whether we want it or not. So we can't keep the Army just the way it is now by freezing in place all of our, POIs and all of our curricula. But at the same time, change is going to come in with the new generation, whether the older generations want it or not. And so next slide, please. And so that concludes my talk. If you're interested in more preparing for war, please go to my website, or if you want to read more about Acts of Madness, which Mike had mentioned is my next project, looking at military strategy in the Pacific from 1898 to 1941. And so with that, I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Let me get back here. Okay. We got our first question. If you have a question, please use the question and answer icon, and I'll pass it. First question is from Joe, and the question is, what about Patton? He learned from Mosby's Civil War tactics and used them in World War II. So is he an aberration, or is he, how does he fit?
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think that it was interesting, and I'm about ready to go on a staff ride next week with a lot of my students, and we're going to go down and tour Civil War battlefields, which is really appropriate because the progressive generation, they were either using, as I mentioned, a lot of them were using German war games, but the other thing that they would often do is that they would use war games that were based off of the Civil War. And so once again, this kind of goes to just how central the Civil War was in the kind of professional formation. But what they would do is they would play Gettysburg, but they would say, okay, but we're going to use, modern organization and modern equipment. And so what does Gettysburg look like if we have, indirect fire, systems that, the 75 that can fire, 8 miles. And so there definitely was a huge hangover in terms of like the tactics and an organizational affinity, like a fondness and for the Civil War in terms of its methods. But I would say that the fact that the Civil War was being taught at schools like Leavenworth, and at that point the Army War College was down in DC, and that the institution was doing that was something that Sherman, when he created Fort Leavenworth, he explicitly said, I don't want a Prussian Kriegsakademie. But then all of these guys like Wagner were kind of undermining him because they're this train from Upton as the commandant to Wagner to some of his successors. And then actually Patton was Leavenworth graduate. And I don't think he went to the War College, if I remember correctly. But certainly, the ideas of how the Army should operate, comes from the Civil War. But how to prepare for war was very much driven by the kind of the new progressive era. And so it's far more like training doctors and lawyers than it was like the way that Sherman imagined training generals.
This comes from an unknown or someone who wishes to remain anonymous. Where do you place technological change in your study? For instance, the emergence of railroads, telegraph, combustion engines.
Yeah, so this is that's a great question. And one of the books that I would throw out there is something to take a look at is Brian Lynn's Echoes of Battle. And so in some ways, because he looks at like some of these, vertical stovepipes and these continuities over time, where I break it, horizontally into generations. And so this is one of those things that I would say is one of the recurring kind of disputes within generations of what role does technology play. And you kind of saw in like the 1911 infantry drill regulations that I had thrown out. At that point, the infantry was completely dominated by the idea that the rifle would overcome everything out there. And because the infantry happened to kind of take over Fort Leavenworth, that became Army dogma and doctrine. But at other points, there were, it would kind of go back and forth. Both Upton and Wagner were really impressed by the introduction. So like Upton, I said at the end of the war, he was commanding a cavalry division. That division was armed with, I believe, the Sharps, repeating carbines. And so he was one of the first ones, because of that experience, to say, oh, wow, technology is really important. And so it would kind of come and go, but also to a certain extent, depending upon your branch, typically, the officers of the coast artillery and engineers were far more technologically inclined, because you have to be. You don't hit a moving object 10 miles from shore by accident. You have to have a whole lot of technology, where sometimes the infantry and sometimes the cavalry would be a little bit more or less towards technology.
Okay. This next question is from our killer's name, Adelbert. He wanted to know, how did funding or budgeting impact this type of change?
Well, and part of what I'm arguing against in the book, for a while, there was an argument in the historiography that, the Army was slow to adapt just because Congress choked it of funds and they weren't able to advance. And that's what held the Army back. And we see that in things like the Spanish-American War in 1898. And there's a certain amount of truth to that. But one of the things that I point out is Congress really never got into telling the Army how to think. And so there's a lot of debates within the officer corps that those were, completely within the bounds of what the Army, could do. And the fact that it resisted making doctrine, one of the other things I highlight in the book is our first true doctrine came out in 1905. And I said that is entirely of a piece. That's not by accident. That's because you start getting things like the Army War College, that you have a unified system of schools, because all of this is coming together to that new professionalism that I highlighted on the one of the last charts there with Marshall and Scott. It didn't make any sense to Scott to do things like that, to tell a commander how to fight. Under the new professionalism, it's second nature to us that those are the sorts of things that the institution should do to set up commanders in order to be effective.
Next question comes from one of our Navy friends, David. Did the establishment of the Naval War College in the 1880s have an impact on the progressive generation of the U.S. Army? And did they see a need then to set up the Army War College in the early 1900s?
Yes, that's a great question. And there's an interesting interplay between the two services on this. And so Stephen Luce, who is the founder of the Naval War College, he actually served off the Carolinas coast in 1864 and 1865. And he was there when Sherman was talking about strategy. And he said, the scales fell from my eyes. I realized I'd only been worried about, hey, how do I make my ship run? And he said, there's this whole other world of ideas out there that we need to train naval officers for. And so it's ironic that Sherman, even though he was the model for this, he said, we don't need things like war colleges. We don't need crease academies. So Luce created the Naval War College, which actually had, Alfred Thayer Mahan is, the very famed naval strategist, was one of the early members, but so was Tasker Bliss, who goes on to become the first president of the Army War College. And so Bliss Auditorium here at the Army War College is named after him. He was the initial Army member. And that was some of what Upton was mirroring, those sorts of thoughts when and then also Luce drew on what Upton was doing at Fort Monroe. After a few years, and people say, hey, Newport, they got something going on, that's going to then feed back into the Army under Root, who was creating it. But the commanding generals up to that time, they didn't really see the need for this sort of thing. So they knew it was out there, but hey, I'm a pretty good general. I didn't have a war college, so why do we need one of those?
This question comes from James. What development occurred regarding the NCO Corps through this same period? Have you looked at them?
Yeah, so it was the development of the NCO and the Army's attitude towards enlisted ranks, as well as the National Guard, are two groups that I don't discuss in this book. And other than, how the regular officers saw them. And so really, up to this time, you can say the Army profession, was really defined by the regular Army Officer Corps, because the NCO Corps, it was all local. And so if you were in a company and the company commander, and actually one of the officers who was commissioned, very rare in the 1880s to have somebody from the ranks, but somebody who I follow in the book, 2 years after enlisting, they made him the first sergeant. But the company commander could just as easily bust you down from sergeant to private. And so we didn't set the conditions. And so it was a fairly, from modern eyes, it looks shameful treatment of the enlisted soldiers. And a lot of this, like I said, is based on some of the class attitudes of the time. And only much later did we realize that we actually had to give some certainty. If you transferred as a soldier from one regiment to the next, you could be a first sergeant, you could be a sergeant major. You lost your rank when you went to your next organization. And so it was going to be until a little bit in the 20th century before we start actually setting the conditions for professionalism to emerge. And so the decisions that I make in this book, in terms of saying, hey, this is the Army is incorporated here, would not pertain, and you'd have to have a much broader reach, and you'd have to look at the enlisted and NCO Corps specifically if you're going to talk about the Army profession going forward. But at this point, it wasn't developed enough to really be a factor.
Yeah, I'll throw in maybe the last question, and that looks at individuals. My understanding is General Nelson Miles was sent on a world tour to allow the route reforms. I don't know if that's true, but how often did you see in the studies that to make these generational shifts, who paid? in a sense? How do they move on those that were considered impediments?
Yeah, and that's a great example. So Nelson Miles is a clerk in a crockery shop in 1861. He ends up rising up to become a general officer during the war. And so somebody like him, it almost, it was in some ways attacked his professional legitimacy if you said that you needed West Point, even just that, much less a war college and a staff college and all these other things that he didn't have. And so most of the commanding generals of the Civil War generation, so even very thoughtful people like, Sherman, Sheridan, and Schofield, they just didn't see the need for these kinds of institutions. And so all of them actively discouraged the creation of something like the Army War College. Miles was so insubordinate that indeed, Root sent him off and said, okay, take a year, tour the world. I'll get all this through Congress in the meantime. But oddly enough, while he was there, the commanding general of the Army, Nelson Miles, was actually trying to dig up examples of Army atrocities in the Philippines so he could put them in the newspaper so he could embarrass Theodore Roosevelt and Elihu Root, both of whom he despised and who despised him in turn.
Some things don't change. Any closing comments?
No, it's been fun. Please take a look at the website. Also, if you're interested in the application of these sorts of ideas of generational to the modern day Army, in 2016, I wrote an article in Parameters that said, okay, so let's take this construct and let's apply it to the present generation. And I'll say that what I call the long war generation, my generation, I said maybe we're not going to necessarily be as good senior leaders as we could be because we'll just be kind of tied up in our own experiences. So with that, thanks to everybody. I'll send Brad Hardy a note here and answer his query directly. So thank you.
Well, thanks again. I enjoyed the presentation, and it's good to see a history department alum having a good book out right now. For those who want to come back again on August 23rd, 7 p.m. again, we'll have Ben Kesley talking to us about Bravo Company and Afghanistan deployment and its aftermath. So we're going to jump up a century and look at the effect on soldiers of that long war that JB just mentioned. So everybody, good night, and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.